Good evening and welcome to World News Tonight here on TVP World. I'm Anna Jabłońska. In today's edition, we will focus on a historical prisoner swap that took place in Ankara, Turkey. We will take a closer look at the released prisoners on both sides. But before we do that, let's take a look at the headlines. Warsaw released a suspected Russian spy to facilitate a prisoner swap agreement. However, Andrzej Poczobut was not among those released by Russia. 80 years ago, 4,300 Sinti and Roma were murdered in Auschwitz in just one night. And boxers Iman Khalif and Lin Yo Tung are caught in a fierce debate over their right to fight as women in the Paris Olympics. Now, the Kremlin has admitted that the Hitman released by Berlin in Thursday's historic prisoner exchange is a member of Russia's security services. Now, joining us live from Kiev with the details is our correspondent Oskar G. Good evening, all. So what can you tell us about this admission from Moscow?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, but probably one that shouldn't be surprising given that they've requested him and Putin has supposedly been maniacal, quoted, in his desire to secure the release of Vadim Krasikov, the FSB hitman who murdered the Georgian Chechen who was living in Berlin. His name Zelimkhan Kangoshvili in 2019. Now, speaking of this, when first asked about Vadim Krasikov's murder, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, said that it was absolutely groundless to say there was any state involvement in that murder, in Vadim Krasikov's murder of Zelim Kangoshvili. Now, today, Mr. Peskov has said Krasikov is an FSB employee. So I think that just shows from Peskov's mouth just how willingly the Kremlin is to lie about its nefarious activities, clandestine activities abroad. And as soon as it became relevant to admit that he is what Putin referred to as a patriot who liquidated a bandit, suddenly the denials are no longer necessary, and he can be greeted, as you're seeing there in Russia, with the Guard of Honor as a national hero for the crime of murdering a Chechen on German soil. Now, this has been a very difficult thing for Germany to do. Also, the Russians that have been given an exchange, some of them didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave Russia. They've now been effectively exiled to Germany. They're giving a statement right now, a press conference, in which Ilya Yashin, the opposition politician who was jailed in Russia, was asked in the morning to write a letter to Putin begging clemency, and he refused. And he said he didn't want to leave Russia, and yet again he was still taken away and included in that exchange. So, unsure what to make of that. But one thing is for certain, we do now know, confirmed by the Kremlin themselves, that Vadim Krasikov, the hitman, the murderer, is an FSB employee, an employee of the Russian government.
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, thank you for your live report, and we will talk to you soon. Now, following years spent behind bars, prisoners taken by Russia finally were able to step out of their cells. 24 prisoners, all jailed for different reasons, were freed by both Moscow and the wider West as part of the biggest prisoner exchange since the Cold War.
Out of a bus and onto a Russian tarmac, prisoners taken by Moscow years ago finally made their way onto a plane headed west. Among them are journalists, activists, and Kremlin critics, as well as a former US Marine.
What's remarkable about this prisoner swap is the scope and the scale. We have 14 prisoners being released from Russia, from a variety of countries. We also have 8 prisoners being released from European and the United States.
The origins of this prisoner exchange deal can be traced back to at least 2022, meaning this swap was years in the making. And given the smiles on the faces of the former prisoners' families and friends, it was well worth the effort.
I meant what I said. Alliances make a difference. They stepped up, they took a chance for us. It mattered a lot. So I'm delighted they're home.
The permanent American residents released by Russia are Wall Street Journal journalist Evan Gershkovich, former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, Radio Free Europe journalist Alsu Kurmasheva, and Russian opposition leader Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was sentenced to 25 years in prison for criticizing Putin's, quote, regime of murders. German nationals who were retrieved from Russian and Belarusian detention are Rico Krieger, Kevin Leek, Demuri Voronin, Herman Moises, and Patrick Schubel.
Here we created a possibility for a large group of people to live freely again, and in some cases to save their health and their life. Thank you.
Finally, joining the list of 16 people released from Russian captivity are Russian opposition figures. They are Ilya Yashin, Alexandra Skochilenko, Oleg Orlov, Lilia Chanisheva, Ksenia Fadiva, Vadim Ostanin, and Andrei Pivovarov. Many of them were associates of late opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who died in Russian captivity in February 2024. Despite the merry mood of the prisoner swap, many outspoken Kremlin critics still remain behind bars.
But I just spent a month in prison in Yekaterinburg where there's a whole, basically everybody I sat with is a political prisoner, and nobody knows them publicly.
Their freedom, however, came at a price, and Moscow made sure to make it steep. Among the 8 Russians released from Western countries, most of whom were convicted of espionage in the past, is Vadim Krasikov. He was convicted in 2021 for the murder of Chechen fighter Zelim Kantornike-Kangoshvili in Berlin in 2019. Some analysts even say that Moscow got a better deal than the West.
Overall, prisoner swap, especially for opposition leaders in Russia, is in Kremlin's interests. Surprisingly, but it's a common tactic. Kremlin tries to push people out. Navalny was perhaps an exception, even though to some extent they tried to push him out as well.
With all that said, one thing is certain. Both the released prisoners and their families can take a long breath of relief, knowing that they're finally home again.
As commemorations continue to mark the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising, further testimony has emerged of the suffering the residents had to go through. In all, some 200,000 people were killed by German forces during the uprising, while those who survived had to endure almost inhumane conditions.
Hundreds honor the last surviving member of a bloody 27-day battle fought at the Polish security printing works. As a teenager, the now 97-year-old Juliusz Kulesza lived and fought during the Warsaw Uprising, and saw sights no one ever should.
That's a difficult one. What was the hardest? I think looking at your friends and brothers in arms dying.
The hardships suffered by the war-weary residents of Warsaw were immense. Civilians were the main casualty of the uprising.
I saw German soldiers shoot at an infant. I can understand shooting at another soldier who is an enemy. I can understand shooting at an adult Pole, a man or a woman. But at an infant, I consider it barbarity.
Disease became widespread, and water was scarce. The plight of women especially was terrible, with the systematic rape and abuse throughout the uprising, starting with a horrendous massacre of the working class district of Wola in the first week of August that claimed around 50,000 victims.
Then what they thought of, let's just pull everybody out of the building, we'll take them to various different spots around Wola, and then we'll just mass murder them. So for example, one was in one of the factories in Wola, Wolska factory. And these people would be taken in 3s, 5s, and just shot and just thrown upon this pile.
An estimated 200,000 people were killed during the uprising by German forces. Warsaw's remaining population was deported, with some 60,000 being sent to Nazi concentration camps. Germany's president Frank-Walter Steinmeier came to Warsaw for the uprising anniversary and asked the Polish people for forgiveness.
On August 2nd, Romani people around the world observe European Holocaust Remembrance Day for Sinti and Roma. Commemorations were held at Auschwitz-Birkenau to mark the 80th year anniversary of the liquidation of the Roma camp. Political leaders from Poland and across the world were in attendance.
The ceremony commemorating the 80th anniversary of the liquidation of the Roma camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau began in front of the monument dedicated to the victims. Among the attendees were the last surviving witnesses of the tragic event.
In the ghettos, in the forest, we survived. Although every day we faced death and inhumane suffering, every day we fought for our lives, and every night was fraught with fear and uncertainty.
Also present were members of parliament, government officials, and representatives of international organizations.
Memory, dear participants, is the mother of humanity. Without memory, people tend to make the same mistakes. Without memory, there is no past many believe. I will tell you that without memory, there is no future.
80 years ago, on the night of August 2nd, 1944, the Germans liquidated the Roma camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Nazis brutally murdered over 4,000 men, women, and children. In total, approximately 21,000 Roma and Sinti from 12 countries perished at Auschwitz.
The Sinti and Roma were persecuted by the Nazis in Germany and all the occupied countries from the start of the war, and even earlier, when the deranged Nazi race theory emerged.
Approximately half of the Roma and Sinti population in German-occupied Europe were killed in the Third Reich's campaign of terror and persecution.
U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is likely to announce who will be her running mate in the upcoming presidential election in the next few days. There are several candidates, but one name is at the top of media predictions.
It's clear we won the election.
Kamala Harris's list of potential VPs include names such as former astronaut Mark Kelly and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. But many U.S. media outlets and analysts point to Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro as the most likely candidate.
But Josh Shapiro has in fact held office. He's been the Attorney General of Pennsylvania for 2 terms and was elected in a very difficult battleground state, was elected by 4 percentage points. There's no question about the fact that the Democrats need Pennsylvania.
On Tuesday, August 6th, Kamala Harris is set to hold her first campaign rally in Philadelphia, a major city in Pennsylvania. She is expected to be there with her vice presidential pick, so it would make sense for it to be the state's governor. Ever since she announced her candidacy, Harris has managed to gather huge support, both financially and in high-profile endorsements.
As the saying goes, if you got something to say, say it to my face.
These words were directed at her biggest opponent, former President Donald Trump, who said he won't meet her in a debate. Trump's candidate for vice president is J.D. Vance, known for his anti-Ukraine sentiments. Vance and Shapiro are vastly different candidates.
On one hand, you have an actual governor who, prior to that, was an actual attorney general who has won a key battleground state, and that's mainly the potential that he delivers. On the other hand, you have a figure, a brand new United States senator, who has mainly carved out for himself a role as a cultural icon.
While Shapiro has a strong chance of becoming the Democratic candidate for vice president, it is not yet set in stone. Kamala Harris should announce her choice by early next week.
And now let's go to the world of sport. The most recent boxing competition at the Paris 2024 Olympics has become a controversial topic for many. A fight between Italy's Angela Carini and Algeria's Iman Khalif has sparked heated discussions, all revolving around one question: is the Algerian boxer a transgender athlete?
The fight only took 46 seconds. Italy's Angela Carini sustained a powerful punch to the nose, after which she dropped out of the fight. Upon Iman Khalif, her Algerian opponent, being crowned the winner of the match, Carini broke down in tears, calling the bout not fair, not right. Khalif has been surrounded by controversy since she was disqualified from participating in the finals of the Women's World Championships last year. Just hours before her match, the International Boxing Association found that she had failed a testosterone level test. The IOC, however, let her compete in the Olympics, and following Thursday's match, stood by their decision.
Many women can have testosterone which is in what would be called male levels, and still be women and still compete as women. So this panacea, this idea that suddenly you do one test for testosterone and that sorts everything out, not the case, I'm afraid.
And everybody's just clapping and going along.
Opponents of the IOC's decision voiced their opinions right after the match ended, with many of them calling the fight unfair.
I think the athletes who have, let's say, male genetic characteristics should not be allowed to compete in women's competitions. And not because we want to discriminate against anyone, but to protect the rights of female athletes to be able to compete on equal terms.
Khalif isn't the first athlete to spark similar controversy, with Caster Semenya, a two-time women's 800-meter dash Olympic champion, facing criticism for her testosterone levels, leading to her dropping out of the Olympics. Meanwhile, Polish athletes are still fighting for medals in Paris. Tennis star Iga Świątek has managed to win bronze against Slovakia's Anna Karolina Schmiedlova, beating her 6-1 and 6-2.
Most of all, I'm very happy that after yesterday's match, I was able to walk out onto the court, that I was professional, and that I was able to reset my mindset. I was happy that I was in the court and able to play in this match. Without that mindset, today's match wouldn't have gone how I wanted it to go.
The Olympics, with all its thrills and upsets, will run until the 11th of August, giving competitors from all corners of the world a chance to make their country proud.
On Friday, activists from the last generation blocked Taylor Swift's arrival at the National Stadium in Warsaw. The protesters sprinkled the entrance with orange powder and held a banner reading, "We can't afford the super rich." Alex Sumlinsky has more.
Friday saw a group of protesters from the last generation glue themselves to this street here leading up to the National Stadium in Warsaw. This is the exact way that Taylor Swift used to access the venue for her concert here in the Polish capital.
Are you ready for it?
One of the activists involved in the protest was a mom of two.
I am a mother, and I'm deeply concerned with the future of my children, and the climate catastrophe is going to impact it. I'm horrified at how the richest of this world are doing nothing to cut down on their consumption and emitting so much carbon dioxide that it's going to destroy us all. We're talking huge figures here. The 1% of the richest emit as much CO2 as 2/3 of the world's poor.
Swift is the latest in a long list of celebrities, government officials, and elite business people to come under scrutiny about private jet travel. Yet Swifties are quick in defending Taylor Swift's jet-setting ways.
Doesn't make a lot of sense. She has done so much in terms of giving back, particularly on her Eras Tour, giving back money to food banks and supporting really important causes. I mean, it's a criticism, but we can hold that same criticism to many individuals throughout the world.
I think she uses it appropriately, and I think there are many other celebrities, especially from the United States, that put out a lot more carbon emissions using their private jets than she does.
Saturday, we'll see Taylor Swift play her third and final concert here in Warsaw for the Eras Tour. For TVP World from Warsaw, Alex Sumlinsky.
And now let's go back to our main topic. Following the agreement between the West and Russia for the release of 16 citizens of the US or other Western countries, the question still stands whether and when Polish-Belarusian activist Andrzej Poczobut will be sent home.
Polish-Belarusian journalist Andrzej Poczobut was imprisoned by the Belarusian regime in the wake of the 2020 protests against Lukashenko's rigged election. Arrested in March 2021, he was sentenced to 8 years in labor camp, but his current situation remains unknown.
We don't have contacts with Belarusian political prisoners. That's a special, treatment of the regime. They try to isolate all the political prisoners from, even from their families.
Following the prisoner swap, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski assured the public that the efforts to free Poczobut are underway.
I would like to assure you that efforts to release other political prisoners, including Belarusian political prisoners like Andrzej Poczobut, are proceeding, but along different avenues. He remains in my thoughts.
Upon the release of the detainees, Joe Biden expressed his gratitude to Poland for making the prisoner release happen, as Poland agreed to free Russian intelligence officer Paweł Rubcow as part of the swap. Poczobut wasn't included in the exchange, though.
The release of Poczobut is an ongoing operation, but it is not being talked about. This is obvious, and it is a #1 priority for us. Belarus knows about it, and Russia knows about it too. Please believe me that, as far as I know, the Polish authorities, they are doing their best to release Poczobut. Perhaps they don't want to let go of this so easily.
But the tensions between Poland and Belarus are still running high.
Warunki polskie są jasne, właśnie między innymi wypuszczenie więźniów.
Poland's conditions are clear. These include the release of political prisoners, including Andrzej Poczobut, a complete cessation of diversionary activities on the Polish border, and the cessation of any support for Russia in relation to the war in Ukraine.
Andrzej Poczobut has overall been arrested over a dozen times by the Belarusian regime. The charges against him were condemned by the international community, including the European Parliament, Reporters Without Borders and Amnesty International. Poczobut is one of 1,500 Belarusian political prisoners, according to official data. Unofficial reports say this figure might be more than 3 times higher.
And joining me right now to talk about the prisoner swap is Andrew Danieri from Eurasia Center, Atlantic Council. Good evening, sir. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So we're talking about 2 years of negotiations, secret talks. The stakes were very high. Now, to put it into perspective, how was the prisoner swap deal struck? I mean, if you consider how many countries were involved, it probably wasn't an easy task.
Absolutely, and I think this is really a feat of diplomacy on the part of the United States and its many partners, including Poland, of course, but also Germany, Norway, Slovenia, and Turkey, to essentially coordinate what became a really complex prisoner swap, the largest we've seen since the end of the Cold War between the West, the United States included, and Russia. And so I think, like you say, this was a multi-year effort with lots of shuttle diplomacy between Washington and Berlin and with other partners across the continent there. And it's possible that even the complexity of this deal actually was helpful in getting all of these folks freed who were unjustly detained in Russian prisons.
Now, the West welcomed back law-abiding citizens. We have American journalist Evan Gershkovich, former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, Vladimir Kara-Murza, a Russian human rights activist, among others. Now, Russia got spies, criminals. Would you say this is a win-win situation?
Well, it's certainly a win to have American citizens back stateside. I mean, I think the goal of any government here in the United States would be to free citizens that have been unjustly detained. That's a political layup, I think. But of course, you're right. The asymmetry here is that we get law-abiding citizens, as you say, people, journalists, human rights activists, and we have to give up people who've actually committed crimes, not only in the United States, but also in Germany. The murder, Vadim Krasikov murdered a dissident there. In Poland, there's spies and other criminals here in the United States. So it's something that I don't think we should make a habit of doing, because we do have to give up real criminals who do harm to our societies when we do these deals. But it was a necessary move to get, as you say, the peaceful and law-abiding people that we did get back.
Now, Sergei Davidis, who is a lawyer who heads the program for political prisoners at the Memorial Human Rights Center, he said that Putin pretty much is doing this on purpose, and he has his ways to get what he wants. But before we talk about that, let's just play a soundbite of Sergei Davidis.
Exactly, Krasikov is difficult for me to say. We don't know the details. There are various speculations on the topic, including that Putin and Krasikov crossed paths at St. Petersburg City Hall. I cannot comment on the personal aspects.
Now, he said that Putin is extremely important, that for Putin it is extremely important that they release people like Krasikov so that crimes can continue. Now, would you say that this is a political game for Putin?
Well, Putin's policy is to, weaponize whatever leverage he has against the West, whether that's taking hostages like we saw. I mean, the case of Evan Gershkovich, the man was a journalist in Moscow, and then he was arrested in Yekaterinburg, basically for doing his job, for being a journalist. And so it certainly looks like a policy by the Kremlin to just take anyone who's American, who's Polish, who their government might want them to be released, and to try to hold them hostage to get someone in return. And we've known for months now, after the infamous Tucker Carlson interview with Putin, when Putin made specific reference to Krasikov, we've known that he'd wanted Krasikov out. So I think it probably is fair to say that Putin wants really the worst of Russian society, these killers, murderers, spies, and criminals back from where they rightly belong, which is in prison.
Some say that this is going to teach Western society, journalists, a lesson that we should just not go to Russia because things like this happen and they have to go through hell. What is your take on that? Is this just the end of objective journalism when it comes to Russia?
Well, I certainly think it's a bad idea for any Westerner, especially an American, frankly, to go to Russia, to go to Belarus, because we see what this policy is. It's hostage taking on the part of Putin and on Lukashenko in Belarus. And American citizens in particular have a responsibility not to go, simply because of the amount of effort, as we just talked about, that it takes to get these people to come back home, and the kinds of people that we have to trade to do it. So the resources that we have to spend on these deals, like you said, that take years, and the criminals that we have to give up to do it, certainly should preclude any American from going to Belarus or to Russia. And now I do think, to the second part of your question, that it obviously does become more difficult then to get good information out of these places like Russia and like Belarus. But that's where I think we need to think about supporting and paying attention to the really excellent Russian and Belarusian journalists that continue there. There are independent media that continue to work in what's a really perilous environment, and they deserve our support. And in cases where it's warranted, like we saw with some of these Russian opposition politicians that were released, our protection as well.
Now, Poland assisted in the release of these political prisoners, and President Biden thanked Poland among other countries. Polish Prime Minister also mentioned that Poland played a huge role in that matter. However, many here in Poland are questioning that Poland did not get anyone in return. And to be specific, they're talking about Andrzej Poczobut, who is a Belarusian and Polish journalist and activist of the Polish minority in Belarus. What do you make of this? Should Poland, in a situation like this, in a very historical moment like this, should we also free someone from Russia?
Well, I think this tells us a few things. I think it tells us, this shows exactly why these prisoner swaps are such a difficult task for the West, because Russia has all the leverage, essentially. And that's in part why I think this became such a complex exchange, because to get anyone that we wanted, that the West wanted out, we had to include all these people like this Russian spy in Poland, Pablo Gonzalez, so-called Pablo Gonzalez. And so again, I think that underscores just how difficult these are, and how it really is the responsibility of citizens of our governments, of our countries, not to put our governments in these positions, because we see the asymmetries that come out of this. And I think Poland is absolutely right that they did give up a Russian spy and didn't tangibly get anything in return. Now, I do think we might see the gentleman you mentioned come back soon. That would be a major positive. But the final point is that this underscores why alliances are so important, and why U.S.-Polish relations are so important. Because we have a couple presidential candidates here, a presidential candidate and a vice president, who want to tear down these sorts of relationships. But we see why having these are in not only our interests here in the U.S., but hopefully down the line will also bear fruit for our Polish partners.
Andrew Danieri from Eurasia Center Atlantic Council was my guest. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thanks very much.
And thank you for watching World News Tonight. Stay with TVP World for more news and updates.